This morning, the Islamic Republic of Iran submitted its response to the United States peace proposal. It was transmitted through Pakistani intermediaries, the same channel that has carried every significant communication between Washington and Tehran for the past 10 weeks. President Trump read it and posted on Truth Social within hours. He wrote, "I have just read the response from Iran's so-called representatives. I don't like it, totally unacceptable." 3 words that tell you everything about where this war is going. And the 4 demands inside that proposal, demands so maximalist that even the Iranian leadership is reportedly split on whether to stand behind them, tell you everything about what Iran actually wants from this negotiation. Because what Iran wants is not a peace deal. What Iran wants is a legal document that transforms this war's outcome from a military defeat into a diplomatic victory. And today, that gambit failed. Here is exactly what happened and exactly why it matters to every person on Earth who buys gasoline. Iran's counterproposal, as reported by Iranian state broadcaster IRIB and confirmed by multiple Western sources with knowledge of the talks, contains 4 core demands. The first is the one that made every diplomat in Washington, London, and Riyadh put down their coffee and read the sentence again. Iran is demanding international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, not a joint maritime administration arrangement, not an Iranian oversight role, not a toll system. Sovereignty, the legal, internationally recognized right of the Islamic Republic of Iran to govern the movement of every vessel through the 21-mile waterway through which 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes every single day. Iran is asking the United States, the country that has been bombing it for 72 days, to sign a document that says Iran owns the world's most important commercial waterway. The second demand, $270 billion in war reparations to be paid by the United States and Gulf states. Iranian President Pezeshkian has said that reparations are the only way to end the conflict. One Iranian official told mediators the figure represents direct and indirect damages to Iranian territory and infrastructure since February 28th. To put that number in context, it is larger than the entire annual GDP of New Zealand. It is roughly equivalent to what the United States spent on the entire 20-year Afghanistan war. Iran is asking to be compensated at scale for the results of a war it began by closing an international waterway that no country legally owns. The third demand, release of all frozen Iranian sovereign assets held by the United States and its partners, assets frozen under years of nuclear-related and terror financing sanctions that predate the current conflict by more than a decade. The fourth, an end to fighting on all fronts, explicitly including Lebanon, which means Iran is demanding that Israel halt its ongoing operations against Hezbollah as a condition for Tehran reopening a strait that Iran does not legally own. And the fifth, or rather the thundering conspicuous absence, the Iranian counterproposal mentions nothing about the nuclear program. Nothing. No suspension of enrichment, no removal of enriched uranium stockpiles, no IAEA access, no moratorium. In a war that the Trump administration launched at least in part to prevent Iran from reaching nuclear breakout capability, Iran's peace response does not acknowledge that the nuclear question exists.
Why this proposal is strategically brilliant, even if it fails. Here is the thing that most coverage of today's news will miss. Iran's counterproposal is not a serious attempt to close a deal this week. It is a negotiating position designed to establish a baseline, to put on record through formal diplomatic channels the maximum set of Iranian demands so that anything Iran ultimately concedes from that position can be framed domestically as a voluntary act of strength rather than a capitulation to American military pressure. In Iranian domestic politics, in the internal power struggle between the government of President Pezeshkian, the Revolutionary Guard Command, and whatever authority the new supreme leader, Khamenei's son Mojtaba, has consolidated since his father was killed in February, the ability to say, "We never surrendered, we negotiated," is existential, not strategically important, existential. Because the alternative, signing a deal that dismantles Iran's nuclear program and reopens Hormuz on American terms, looks inside Tehran like unconditional surrender. And unconditional surrender, in the political culture of the Islamic Republic, tends to end careers, sometimes more than careers. The sovereignty demand over the Strait of Hormuz is particularly clever because it costs Iran nothing to ask for it and everything to receive it. If the U.S. says yes, which it will never do, Iran wins a 100-year strategic prize. If the U.S. says no, which it has, Iran can tell its domestic audience, "We asked for what was rightfully ours, and the Americans refused. We will keep fighting." The demand is designed to be refused. Its purpose is not agreement. Its purpose is the refusal. Iran's counterproposal is not a peace plan. It is a mirror. It reflects back at Washington the terms under which Iran believes this war should be judged by history, not as a military defeat, but as an economic siege that Iran endured while the aggressor refused to pay for what it destroyed. Whether that framing succeeds depends entirely on what happens next. The nuclear silence, the most alarming element of today's proposal. Iran's counterproposal says nothing about its nuclear program. This is not an oversight. Iranian Foreign Minister Arakchi spent the weekend in Muscat meeting Omani officials, then flew back to Islamabad for a second round of talks and is expected in Moscow on Monday to meet Vladimir Putin. At every stop, according to sources with knowledge of the discussions, Arakchi made clear that there is no internal consensus inside the Iranian government about what nuclear concessions, if any, are acceptable. The hardliners, principally the IRGC command, have reportedly blocked any language in the counterproposal that acknowledges the nuclear question, not because they don't know the U.S. wants an answer on it, because answering it in any form is a concession, and concessions right now are politically radioactive inside Tehran.
What Iran has reportedly offered, in separate back-channel discussions, is a suspension of uranium enrichment, but for a period far shorter than the 20-year moratorium the U.S. has proposed. Iran has explicitly rejected the dismantling of its nuclear facilities. It has rejected permanent enrichment caps. The gap between the U.S. position and the Iranian position on the nuclear question is not a negotiating gap that can be bridged with clever language. It is a fundamental disagreement about whether Iran has the sovereign right to enrich uranium at all. The U.S. says no, Iran says yes, and until one of them moves, really moves, not diplomatically signals, the nuclear issue is not getting resolved in this negotiation. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Mike Waltz was explicit on the Sunday shows. President Trump has been clear they will never have a nuclear weapon and they cannot hold the world's economies hostage. That is a red line, not a preference, not an aspiration, a red line. And Iran's counterproposal, by not mentioning the nuclear program at all, effectively dared Trump to enforce it. The oil market, the war everyone is actually fighting. While diplomats negotiate and generals prepare and presidents post on social media, the real verdict on this war is being delivered every day by the global oil market. This morning, Brent crude rose 3.17% to $104.50 a barrel. U.S. crude climbed 3.21% to $98.48. The American average gas price is now $4.52 a gallon, according to AAA, a level that is beginning to show up in U.S. consumer confidence data, inflation readings, and, most dangerously for any administration, in the kind of kitchen table conversations that historically decide midterm elections. Goldman Sachs has already said it expects Brent crude to remain above $90 a barrel through at least the end of the year. That is their base case. Their upside risk scenario, in which the Strait of Hormuz remains closed into Q3, has oil above $120. One Qatari LNG tanker crossed the strait on Sunday for the first time since the war began. Iran allowed it, a deliberate goodwill gesture to Qatar, one of the key mediating states, and to Pakistan. It was a symbolic opening. It moved the needle on precisely nothing. One tanker in 72 days. Before the war, 138 vessels transited the strait daily. The economic damage to global shipping, supply chains, and energy markets from that closure, not the damage to Iran, which is immense, but the damage to the rest of the world, is already measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And every day the strait stays closed, that number grows. The market understood today's news immediately. Talks stall, oil goes up. The market is not optimistic. The market is pricing in a longer war.
What comes next? The Monday Situation Room Meeting. On Monday, Trump will convene a Situation Room meeting with his national security and foreign policy team to discuss the stalled negotiations and potential next steps. 3 U.S. officials confirmed the meeting to Axios. The agenda, according to one source, will be the stalemate in the negotiations and potential next steps. That is diplomatic language for the last proposal failed, what do we do now? The options on that table are not comfortable ones. Accepting Iran's counterproposal is not an option. Trump has already said so publicly and in terms that leave no diplomatic off-ramp. Returning to military escalation, new strikes on Iranian infrastructure, a tighter naval blockade, or the threat of strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities that Trump has repeatedly made and not yet executed, carries the risk of collapsing whatever ceasefire architecture remains and fully restarting a war that is costing the American economy $4.52 at every gas pump in the country. And doing nothing, maintaining the current ambiguous half-ceasefire, half-conflict posture, means oil stays at $100 plus indefinitely, the strait stays closed, and the political cost of this war keeps accumulating at the domestic level. There is a fourth option that Axios reported this weekend, one that Iran has quietly floated through back channels, a 2-stage deal. First, reopen the strait and end active hostilities, with the U.S. lifting its naval blockade of Iranian ports. Second, begin nuclear negotiations from that new baseline, after the immediate crisis is resolved. The White House received this proposal, according to sources with knowledge, but has not indicated whether it will engage with it. The problem with the 2-stage approach from Washington's perspective is transparent. Once the strait is open and the shooting stops, the U.S. loses its primary leverage over Iran's nuclear decisions. A ceasefire without a nuclear agreement is, from Trump's stated war objectives, a war he did not win. And a war he did not win in the political vocabulary of this White House is not an acceptable outcome 11 months before the midterms. The ceasefire is a container. Right now, it is barely holding. Inside it, Iran is asking for $270 billion and the legal deed to the Strait of Hormuz. The United States is asking for a nuclear deal Iran's military won't allow its government to sign, and the world is paying $104 a barrel while they negotiate. 2 other stories that broke today add essential context to the impasse. First, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told CBS in an interview that he wants to reduce U.S. military aid to Israel from $3.8 billion a year to 0. He said, "I think it's time that we weaned ourselves from the remaining military support." That statement, which would have been unthinkable 18 months ago, reflects a new Israeli confidence born directly from this war, the conviction that Israel's military relationship with the U.S., while valuable, is no longer a dependency but a partnership, and that reducing it reduces American leverage over Israeli operational decisions. Netanyahu separately spoke with Trump on Sunday evening as Iran submitted its counterproposal, according to sources familiar with the call. The 2 men agreed that Iran retains too much enriched uranium and that the war is not over. That alignment matters because the party most likely to break the current diplomatic stalemate through unilateral military action is not Washington, it is Jerusalem. Second, Iranian Foreign Minister Arakchi flew to Moscow on Monday to meet Vladimir Putin. The timing is not coincidental. With the peace proposal rejected and the Trump-Xi summit 5 days away, a summit that could reshape U.S.-China-Iran dynamics in ways Tehran cannot predict, Arakchi is doing what Iran always does when it feels diplomatically isolated. It goes to Moscow. It reminds Russia that a cornered Iran is a destabilizing Iran. It reminds Putin that China and Russia's shared interest in keeping America tied down in the Middle East is best served by keeping this war exactly where it is, inconclusive, expensive, and consuming American strategic bandwidth that would otherwise be pointed at Beijing and Moscow simultaneously. Here is the picture on day 72. Iran asked for the Strait of Hormuz and $270 billion and said nothing about its nuclear program. Trump said totally unacceptable. Oil went to $104, gas went to $4.52. A Qatari tanker crossed the strait for the first time in 10 weeks. Netanyahu said he wants to pay for his own weapons. Arakchi flew to Moscow. And in a situation room in Washington on Monday, the most powerful man on earth will sit down with his advisors and answer one question. If diplomacy failed, what is option 2? The world will know the answer to that question very quickly, because in the Strait of Hormuz in the spring of 2026, when one option closes, the next one tends to arrive with a missile attached. If you think Iran's counterproposal is a negotiating opening that will eventually lead to a deal, comment deal. If you think the Monday Situation Room meeting ends with a decision to escalate militarily, comment strike. Stay sharp, stay informed, and check your gas tank, because the price on that pump is the most honest number in this entire story.